Greetings, Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me today. It's a little windy, so I'll be sure to speak up so you can hear me. What I wanted to share with you today, it comes from William. William's a Tlingit elder. He used to live down in southeast Alaska. He asked me not to speak of the exact place. He still owns the property, hasn't been back. So, back in 1978, William he had finished building his cabin over there a couple years before that, and he really loved going out there. He had his own little crab pods, and he would set them out as he was coming into the cabin, so on the next tide he can go out, grab his fresh crab, you know what I mean? And he enjoyed the sea life and all that. He'd see the orcas coming through, and it was just beautiful. Now, where his cabin is it's in this little bit of a bay, and it's like tucked back up into the trees at just the right spot to where it avoids all the winds, all the coastal winds and stuff. He loves the place. It was evident talking to him. Now, what occurred was, for the first week he was out there, it was no issue. You know, he was getting a couple crabs a day, which is perfect. That's all he needed. You know, if he ever got extras, he just let them go immediately. You know, it was just mainly to have that fresh seafood, you know, while he was there. Well, he had noticed about a week in on this visit, this very large sea otter off in the distance. At first it was staying off in the distance, and he thought it was strange how big this thing was. And so he was like, oh, well, it's Alaska, you know, things get big, whatever. You know, it was no big deal. At least initially, that's what he thought initially. And so the following day, on the tide, he was out there retrieving his crab pots, and there was no crab in them. And there's this sea otter again, so he attributed it to this sea otter, you know, eating all the crab or whatever. So he decides, he had a few rocks in the skiff that he had picked up over the time, and so he threw some rocks at this otter to scare it away, not to directly hit it, but just to scare it away, get it, you know, chase it out of the area, so to speak. And he did that day, reset the pots with fresh bait, came back the next day, otter was nearby, nothing in the pots. So, you know, he's getting a little more upset, so he chucked some more rocks, you know. And to each his own, you know, it is what it is. You know, he thought that because he could have got seal bombs and, you know, threw seal bombs out there, and boom, you know, explosion underwater, but he didn't, he just threw some rocks. He figured it would work. So he threw rocks again on the second day and reset the pots, you know, trying to get across to this sea otter that, hey, this is my area, get out of here, you know. And it wasn't working. So when he comes back on that third day, he sees the sea otter as he's coming up to his pots. He has little marker buoys, and he comes up and he already knows there's not going to be anything in the pots. So he immediately starts chucking rocks at this thing, and one of the rocks came pretty close, and the otter at the time was about 25 feet away, and he said it was just so big, you know, it seemed just so out of place to be there. And so he was just like, all right, it is what it is, and chucks rocks, right? Thing dives under, he doesn't see it, and it pops up about 70 yards away. However, when it pops up, the sunlight's beaming right on this thing, right? I mean, beaming right on it. And it's just dark, it's just black. But it's a silhouette of the sea otter. And he's kind of thrown off. He kind of gets a creepy vibe from it because it's just pitch black, you know, when it pops up about 70 yards away. And so he thinks about shooting it. You know, he's like, man, should I just shoot this thing? And then he was like, no. You know, it probably, I'm not here all that much, so maybe it hunts here all the time, and I'm, you know, intruding. So he was like, nah, that wouldn't be right to just shoot this thing. So he let it be. He chucked one more rock. It didn't even come close, you know, but this thing just watched him. And when he got back to shore, and he was, you know, pulling up his line, you know, because the tide was just starting to go out, so he drew the line up to shore and anchored it off or whatever. Now, when he comes back to the boat to retrieve his gear, this thing is about 50 yards right offshore, looking at him, still pitch black, silhouette of a sea otter. And he got the EBGBs. He said it that scared him. The way it was just ominous feeling, the way this thing was right out there, and just he felt it looking at him, even though it was just a black silhouette, couldn't see eyes. When the days before, it was a sea otter face, cute, fuzzy, you know, whiskers, the whole bit. But this thing was black. It was just pitch black, no nothing. And so he gathered up his stuff, kind of thought it was odd, and figured, okay, well, if it gets out of control, I'll shoot it. You know, I'll just get rid of it. But it's something he didn't want to do, you know. So he retreats inside, and you know, he has at that time about 8 more hours of daylight, right, before it started getting dark. So during that 8 hours, he'd be doing stuff around his cabin, cleaning up and doing whatever. And every once in a while he'd look out, because he had a straight path right on down to the beach, and then it dropped down to the gravel and then went out, you know, and his boat was right there, you know, it was tied off nearby, and he could see right out into this little bay. And every time he would look out there, black silhouette right out in the water, sometimes a little closer, sometimes a little further, but always appearing to be looking at him, right? And, you know, he said about a couple hours before it got dark, you know, before, you know, the sun was going down, and again, land of the midnight sun, he wasn't going to get total darkness, but where he was in the trees, it would get dark. It's just the sky would still be light. You know, anyone who's dealt with it, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, he chose a couple hours before the sun went down to go down to the beach. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder, and he picked up some rocks he could throw pretty far. Sorry, my phone's making noise over here. Let me shut that off real quick. It gets annoying when I'm trying to record and I forget to turn it off. I apologize. So he starts, you know, a little smaller than the baseball sized rocks, and he starts chucking them at this otter because it's closer to shore. And he's not even coming close, you know, but it's landing near it, and it would go under and then pop up over here. He'd throw a few more, and he spent about 40 minutes chucking rocks till his arm was sore, and he was like, I'm wasting my time. This thing ain't going anywhere, you know. And then he's still contemplating shooting it, but he couldn't commit to that. He goes back up, he does his thing, he eats dinner, and he starts a small fire. Just because it was wet, cold, and some of his clothes were wet. They had fallen down in the skiff when he was out in the water earlier, and so had a little pot-bellied stove, and he just lit it. Not a big roaring fire by any means, but just enough to warm up some clothes and dry them out. Well, he would, every once in a while, his curiosity would get to him. He'd go and look out the window, and sure enough, there's that shadow out there in the water, just bobbing. He felt it looking at him, you know, even though at this point it was just a black silhouette. And so he's not enjoying it, right? There's something about it that's off. So he sits down, he ends up eating. The fire had pretty much died down, and the clothes were pretty much dry. So he was in the process of getting those put away and everything. And he said something drew his attention over to the window just as the sun had gone down, and it was dark in the tree line, but it was still light out on, you know, up in the sky. And he could still make out the shoreline and everything, but it was pretty dim, you know, pretty darn hard to see. And as he's standing there, he's looking, and he notices the otter's coming out of the water, and it's shaped just like a sea otter, but it's pitch black. It's like a very dark shadow, right? And it comes out, and he's looking, he's like, oh, it's out of the water. You know, I hope it's not gonna like mess with his line or something. You know, he didn't know, so he was just kind of watching it. This thing turns and starts coming up his trail. And as it's coming up the trail to the cabin, the shadow is changing. He couldn't say exactly what, but as it was coming forward, the shadow was getting bigger, and all of a sudden it's on 2 feet, and it's over 8 foot tall, and it's walking past. It's walking past his window. Next to his door is facing the bay, and then there's no windows along this side of the cabin, and he's up on pilings, right? They're about 6 foot off the ground, and this thing walks past, and he's in shock because this thing went from the shape of an otter, and it's pitch black, to morphing as it's moving towards the cabin rather quickly, because his cabin's a good 70, 80 yards tucked back up in the trees. This thing just barrels on up as it's morphing, and all of a sudden it's on 2 feet, and he's kind of leaning back from the window, and it walks past, and he's in shock seeing this, right? And he was just like, when I was asking him how he felt, he said he was terrified inside to the point where he wasn't breathing, right? Well, all of a sudden the whole cabin is pushed over, the whole thing. It falls off, it's pushed off the pilings, and it basically kind of rolls over onto the roof, right? And he doesn't know how long he was out, but he knows he had gotten knocked out by this, because when he came to, part of his clothes were pinned down by that stove, and thankfully there wasn't any coals in there left to start the place on fire, because it had it been still a fire going, he would have perished. So he fought to get the stove off his clothes, got up and sat there, squatted down, trying to figure out what just happened, right? But obviously time had passed, because it's really a lot darker outside at this point. Now, I asked him, was there any noises involved? Was there any screeches, weird noises you'd never heard? And he said it was just silence. When this thing came out of the water and just did its morphing thing, and all of a sudden he could see it, this dark shadow walking on 2 legs, that's all he could make out. And one other thing that he had mentioned is he noticed it had an otter-like tail as it came by as he was watching, because he was trying to make sense of it in his mind, because it was all happening real fast. So as he's gathering himself off of basically the ceiling now, the roof of his cabin, he's looking around. He gets his rifle, and he finds it. He gets some ammo. He grabs his basically a little pack he carried with him everywhere that had all his pertinent stuff in it. He grabbed a hold of that, and he wanted to go out and leave, but the tide was out. It was dark out, and so he sat there. And he basically got the door open. Everything was all jacked up. All the windows were broken and stuff, and he was worried this thing was still out there. He couldn't see it, right? And so he's just standing there just praying that his boat hadn't been messed with. Now, I've sat like that, not knowing what's going to happen next, and it's a horrible, gut-wrenching feeling. So I totally understand what he was going through, but finally it got light enough out to where he came out of the cabin, circled around it looking for this thing, and there's shadows everywhere. So he's hyper paranoid. He can't make one shadow out from another, so he's feeling that pressure of the unknown, right? So what he said he did was he got down to the shore where his boat was. He untied it, threw the rope in, put his pertinent stuff in, and basically sat in the skiff looking around, because he had more visible area to view, and just waited. He said initially he was really concerned about the shadows on shore, and because he was traumatized from his cabin getting pushed off the pilings and landing a damn near on its roof, right? And so he said he was sitting there, he realized there's a lot of water behind him, and he's not even paying attention. So this poor guy, he had to sit there, and you got to understand, he was not in his right mind, a lot of trauma going on. He didn't know which way to look. So at one point, he just slunk down with his back against the bottom of the skiff, looking up into the sky, and just praying nothing came and peeked over the edge of his skiff. And he had his rifle ready. He was worked up, to say the least. He was severely traumatized by it, as you can imagine, but finally got light enough, and at some point he had dozed off. He doesn't know how it happened. He was so jacked up. He assumes it was from the adrenaline dump, coming off of that and everything. He fell asleep for a little bit. When he woke up, he could hear the water hitting the skiff. That's one of the things that woke him up, that glunk sound of the water, on the outside of the skiff. So he looked around, saw nothing. It was daylight now. The tide was high enough to where he just jumped out, pushed off with the bow, hopped in, fired it up, and he he found a temporary job doing some salmon seining just to earn enough money to fly away from Alaska. He went and visited some family down in the States and ended up settling in Kansas somewhere. Now, I asked him, I was like, well, have you been back? He won't come back to Alaska. As it is, he has a hard time seeing the antelope out there. And when he sees them, all he could think is they might be a shapeshifter. They might be one coming to look for me. So he has a very hard time to this day. And this happened in 1978. And to this day, you know, he has a very hard time with that. And it was evident talking to him, you know. He wants me to send a warning out to people in Southeast. Don't throw rocks at sea otters. Don't throw rocks. He reiterated that to me several times. And I used to throw seal bombs, you know, at the sea lions and seals when they were getting in our salmon net. But I never threw rocks at sea otters. But just a warning down Southeast, you never know what that otter's about, so to speak. But don't throw rocks at otters. I want to thank William for sharing that. It was not easy. It was, we must have had about 7 or 8 different conversations, and only some of the conversations dealt with this instance. Because of the trauma involved, he had to reset. He had to calm down. He would get worked up really fast, you know. And one of the things that stands out is when he said when he woke up and that pot-bellied stove had his clothes pinned to the ground, and how it could have went a different way. And, you know, it's hard to reconcile those things, you know. It's like this weird survivor's guilt kind of thing. Even though no one was dead or anything like that, it's real weird. It's hard to put into words unless you've experienced it. However, I want to thank him for having the fortitude to come forward, share that. And again, you know, he's an elder now, but he cut all ties. He wouldn't even come back up for his father's funeral, his mother's funeral, a couple of his sister's funeral. He won't come to Alaska. He felt, and still feels, run out. He felt like he had to leave, and he just can't come back. He just can't do it. Which I can't fault the guy for that, you know. Anyway, William, thank you. If you watch this, like I told you, bud, if you want to respond to comments, it's up to you. However, you will, you know, if you want anonymity, you're going to reveal who you are when you do that, if you do that. So if you choose, that's up to you. You said you'd decide before I posted this, but I want to thank you for sharing that with us. I know it's not easy, you know, and he found me by happenstance. He was, you know, he knows some people that are coming up to Alaska, and so he said he would look into, you know, the tour guides or whatever for him. And damn, Skeeter. So I guess he was looking up Alaska tours or something, and looking under Alaska, one of my blips popped up on Google search or whatever, and so he got curious and checked it out. And from what he said, he had watched some of the videos and kind of followed along for a little bit before he decided to share with me. So I appreciate you having the confidence in me to share that with everyone. And let's see, I believe that was it. Again, thank you, William. I appreciate your time, man. And thanks everyone for joining me, and we'll catch you on the next one.